everybody, and welcome to the A to Z's of application monitoring with vRealize Operations 8.6. My name is Matt Bradford. I'm a staff technical marketing architect for VMware's cloud management focused on vRealize Operations. And in today's session, we're going to be covering the various ways that we can monitor our services and applications through vRealize Operations, starting with service discovery. Then we're going to dive into agent-based monitoring using the vRealize Operations Telegraph agent. Then we'll take a look at how we can extend things even further by leveraging the open source Telegraph agent. And finally, we'll talk about how we can integrate vRealize Operations with existing tools that your organization may already be using. Now, unfortunately, in this session, we won't have time to cover the vRealize True Visibility Suite, which can also bring in a lot of really good information about the various applications that you may have out there. However, I'd recommend checking out our VMware Cloud Management YouTube channel because there are a lot of great demos out there for specific applications that we can monitor through the vRealize True Visibility Suite. So, really the three key areas we're going to focus the most on today are the Service Discovery Management Pack, again, the vRealize Operations Telegraph agent, and the open source Telegraph agent. Now, starting with the Service Discovery Management Pack, this is available in vRealize Operations Advanced and Enterprise, and this is really kind of the entry level into application monitoring with vRealize Operations. So what this does is it's an agentless based way of discovering services running on your virtual machines. So we can get information, right? We can understand what is running on our virtual machines to help with things like project planning or just understanding our applications, right? So there are 43 predefined services that we provide, but you can also define your own, and we're going to go into how you can do that in a couple different ways. It also can automatically identify applications. So if we have a number of services, right, these are going to make up things like applications. So how can we take what we've discovered and add a little bit more information and context to it by understanding that these services all make up an application. There's also a couple other really cool things we can do through the Service Discovery Management Pack as far as troubleshooting goes, or even remediation through things like the top N processes, and also being able to execute scripts on the virtual machines without an agent. And lastly, really, again, this is kind of why this is sort of the entry level into application and service monitoring, because it does provide some basic utilization metrics and also availability. So if we want to see if a service is running or not running, right, and we can get alerted when that happens. So it can provide a pretty good amount of information that may be suitable for you. Next, we'll dive into the vRealize Operations Telegraph agent. So now this is an agent-based approach, and this is available for application monitoring. It's available in vRealize Operations Enterprise and Cloud. And there's a bit of an asterisk there. We're going to get into that in the next slide here. But it can also collect OS level metrics, so we can understand the various volumes, right? We can actually kind of understand the layout of the file system on those virtual machines, right? We can also get those OS level metrics. So, we can observe things through vRealize Operations at the hypervisor level, but now through the Telegraph agent, we can also get those metrics from the OS. How does the OS see its performance, right? There are 25 very popular applications that we can monitor through the vRealize Operations Telegraph agent, and we support both Linux and Windows OSs. This can also monitor the state of our services and processes. We can run custom scripts to collect metrics from our applications and our virtual machines into vRealize Operations, and it can also provide various checks like ping checks and HTTP checks, right? We can go out and we can reach out to a web page and we can get the response code that we're getting from that. Are we seeing a 200 response code, or are we seeing some sort of errors with 404 or 500s, right? So there's a lot we can do with the vRealize Operations Telegraph agent. Now, if we want to take things beyond that, right, there's the open source Telegraph agent, and this is provided through Influx Data. And if you look at their documentation, they've got over 200 input plugins that are pre-built that you can just run on the open source Telegraph agent. So this takes the number of applications and services that we can monitor well beyond what we offer today with the vRealize Operations Telegraph agent. Now, one thing I'll point out, kind of a big difference between the vRealize Operations Telegraph agent and the open source Telegraph agent is the vRealize Operations Telegraph agent is managed through the vRealize Operations UI, whereas the open source Telegraph agent is something that you install yourself and you manage through your own processes. So kind of a big difference there, but there is a lot of flexibility with the open source Telegraph agent. Again, we support Windows and Linux OSs as far as monitoring goes. And this can be installed, actually both agents can be installed on physical OSs as well. So there's a lot of flexibility here. Now that asterisk that I was talking about before with the vRealize Operations Telegraph agent and frankly the open source Telegraph agent, we do support OS level monitoring. So if you're going to use the vRealize Operations Telegraph agent or open source Telegraph agent for monitoring those OS level metrics, and you have vRealize Operations Advanced, then you are entitled to install those agents. Now, once you start monitoring applications, that's where you need vRealize Operations Enterprise level licensing or vRealize Operations Cloud. Right, service discovery is available in, again, both vRealize Operations Advanced and Enterprise and Cloud, and then APM integration is available in Enterprise and Cloud. So hopefully that clears up the licensing side of things and what you may be entitled to as we go through the presentation here. So let's start off with talking about the vRealize Operations Service Discovery. So this is agentless, and there's also a credential-less way that we can monitor and discover services. So, first of all, what it'll do is it is exactly as it sounds, right? Service discovery. So leveraging VMware tools, we can actually reach inside those virtual machines and we can discover what is running on them. Now, I'll just clarify, when we say service within vRealize Operations, that is defined as a process that is listening on a port. So we do need to make sure that process is listening on the port. There are ways to tell that. But that's what we're going to go out and we're going to discover those. So whether it's, we're leveraging the out-of-the-box services, or if we've created our own custom services, if any of those are a match on your virtual machine, vRealize Operations will discover those. And again, we can get basic level metrics and availability for those services. Now, of course, again, there are some really good troubleshooting methods that we can leverage service discovery for. And then it's also natively part of the vSphere account configuration. So we don't need to install any additional management packs. It's all available out of the box. Once you connect vRealize Operations to your vCenter, you can actually configure service discovery from within that adapter configuration. So, again, there are 43 predefined services in service discovery. We can create our own. Service discovery will run once a day on all virtual machines. So we're not querying every virtual machine every 5 minutes. That's actually asking quite a bit of our vCenters and our virtual machines too. We don't want to go out there and causing a whole lot of activity on our virtual machines. So we do look at this once a day. We go through and we evaluate all the virtual machines within a vCenter. We actually do that in chunks of 20 at a time as well. So just kind of point that out too. Once you enable service discovery, and if you notice things aren't getting discovered just yet, give it a little bit of time and they will get picked up. So just kind of looking at some of the metrics that we can collect from service discovery. So we do get information about what is the CPU demand and memory demand and IO throughput, or the number of connections to the services that are discovered. We can also get the status property, which will tell us whether or not the service is running or if it's not running, right? And again, we can alert based on that. So, we don't get a whole lot of really deep level metrics. Say it's a database, right? We don't necessarily get into the nitty gritty here, but we can provide, again, some very basic information about those services. Now, like I said, enabling service discovery is quite easy. So within your vCenter integration or cloud account, right, there's this tab for service discovery. Click on that. You can enable service discovery. You can provide some default username and passwords. So if it's Windows or Linux and you use common credentials across your environment, you can provide those here. But of course, we can go with VM to VM level of credentialing. So we don't have to use common credentials if your organization does not leverage those, but we do have a fair number of customers that do leverage that. So this is available within vRealize operations. Now, I'll just call out as well, because service discovery does leverage VMware tools, we do require version 11.1 or higher for credential-less service discovery. So check out the KBs and everything within the documentation for vRealize operations. Just make sure that you do have the right levels of VMware tools installed, but really 11.1 and on, you should be in pretty good shape, especially if you want to leverage credential-less. So how do we enable credential-less service discovery? Well, again, through the integrations. So underneath our vCenter, there is the service discovery adapter. So unlike the previous slide where we actually just enabled service discovery under that tab for our vCenter, here we need to go into the adapter itself. So it's actually a child object of the vCenter within our integrations page. And once you edit that, there's the option here to enable credential-less service discovery. So why is credential-less important? Well, for customers who are maybe you're leveraging some sort of password manager where you are cycling through passwords on a regular basis, it's kind of a pain to go through each virtual machine and enter those credentials yourself, right? So that's a little bit of a challenge for some customers, and that's where credential-less can really help out. So how are we leveraging credential-less? Well, there's actually a plugin within VMware tools that we can actually connect to that will allow us to do the service discovery. So that's kind of how this works under the covers. Now, credential-based service discovery, again, we can provide common credentials across all of our virtual machines, or we can provide credentials on a one-by-one or multiple virtual machine basis. We basically select the virtual machines we want, and in the drop-down here, we can provide a password. Now, with all these different credential options, how does this work? Well, if we have credential-less service discovery enabled, vRealize operations will try that method first. If it can't, for some reason, maybe VMware Tools isn't the right version, or for some other reason, if credential-less service discovery doesn't work for that virtual machine, then we'll fall back to either the defined credentials here on the VM by VM basis, or using common credentials. So that's kind of how that tiering works as far as deciding which approach vRealize operations is going to use. Now, creating custom services, right? If we again want to be able to discover something that's not available within vRealize operations, we can very easily do that. Now, again, a service must be listening on a port in order to be discovered, but we can provide basically the process name and the port number, and we're done, right? Of course, we need to provide a friendly name that will appear in vRealize operations, but that's it, really, right? Once you provide that information, the next time vRealize operations runs a service discovery, that service will get picked up. Now, what about services that maybe are running on dynamic ports? Maybe it's not always running on the same port, or listening on the same port rather, every time. Maybe it's listening on a range of ports. Well, in vRealize operations 8.6, we introduced service discovery defined by regular expression. So the cool thing here is we don't need to provide a port number. Now, yes, the service still needs to be listening on a port, but at this point, we don't really care what port it's listening on. As long as it's listening on a port, we can provide this via regular expression. Now, some of the other cool things we can do with regular expression, because we're actually evaluating against the command line or the, I think it's the path and PS, right? So if you look at WMIC in Windows, or if you look at PS within Linux, right, we're actually evaluating based on the command line. So, in this case with regular expressions, we can actually specify, right, because we have the full path of where that process is running. We could actually specify if we have services that are maybe running as java.exe, right? There's a lot of different services that run as that because they're Java based. Well, if Java is installed here or if it's installed there, right, it could potentially be a different service. So we can actually specify through regular expression which path we specifically want to look at, or for services that maybe have information that could change, like the version number of that service in the path. We can either specify a very specific version or just say ignore all of that, right? So there's a lot of power we can do with regular expressions here. And then once we've got our services, whether it's custom services or out-of-the-box services, once they've been discovered by vRealize operations, now we can tell vRealize operations, okay, if you see these specific services running within a virtual machine or even across multiple virtual machines, right, as long as those services are talking to each other, then consider that an application. Now, you may be wondering, okay, well, vRealize Network Insight will look at network flows and traffic flows and identify applications that way. So are we doing the same thing in vRealize operations? And no, not exactly. We're not looking at network traffic flows or flows going across the network like vRealize Network Insight is. Again, we're looking at connections between services. So from within the virtual machine, if we see service A is connected to service B, right? We can identify that. And again, if it's coming from another virtual machine and we see that connection within the OS, then we can identify that as an application as well. So it's a little bit different because we are just looking at, really what are those connections within, the virtual machines. Basically, we're looking at net stats, right, within vRealize operations. So we don't have the same insights that vRealize Network Insight has as far as, what is actually flowing over the network. But we can still do this discovery within, service discovery here. So this is kind of great, right? So now we can identify, okay, this group of services is this application. And I can even go in to the application and see the services that are running. And I can even see, who is talking to what services are connected to what within here as well. So that's kind of a cool new feature that we've got in vRealize Operations 8.6. Now, some of the other cool things that we can do with service discovery that you may even want to leverage service discovery just for these features alone. Now, say we are troubleshooting a virtual machine that all of a sudden CPU is just through the roof, right? Demand is at 100+%, okay? Well, the next step in our troubleshooting is obviously figure out, okay, who is eating all those resources, right? Who's the CPU hungry process that either is running a really big job or just ran away. So we can actually leverage the top N processes. So, top N meaning we could look at the top 10 processes. I think it goes up to 100, might even go a little bit higher than that. But we can see, what processes are running on that virtual machine. We're essentially running top, right? So I can look at what processes are eating all of my CPU. So I can really kind of dive in even deeper into that virtual machine without ever having to RDP or SSH into that virtual machine. I can run it all through vRealize operations. Then there's also script execution. So if there's a command that I need to run on a virtual machine to further troubleshoot or to resolve an issue, I can actually do that through service discovery, right? I can actually execute a script from within there. And vRealize operations will give you the output too. So it's not like you just run a script and vRealize operations tells you whether it's successful or not. But if you need to get more information to help you troubleshoot better, right, we can actually provide the output of that script within vRealize operations. Now, how does this work with credential-less service discovery. Well, if you are leveraging credential-less, we still require you to provide credentials to run top-end or to execute scripts. That's just for, basic security. You can also configure RBAC within vRealize operations so that only certain users within vRealize operations have the ability to execute scripts or to run top-end. So we do have a lot of security built around that within vRealize operations. So, kind of taking a look a little bit closer at the script execution here, basically within the virtual machine actions drop-down menu, right? We can, the execute script option is available within there. So here we're looking at a virtual machine that got an alert that says, hey, one or more guest file systems is running out of space. Well, I can run into the virtual machine, execute a script here. So I'm running a PowerShell command here just to get an idea of, maybe it's a folder that tends to fill up, right? So I can get information about, what files are within that folder within vRealize operations. So just a couple things to point out too, again, kind of back on that security vein, is that all actions are logged for auditing as well, right? We do have that too for tracking. And then also avoids exposing the OS through remote access tools too. So if you do have policies for disabling SSH or maybe RDP on your virtual machines, this is another great way to be able to get into the VM to run these. And again, all of this is leveraging VMware tools. So again, the top-end processes, so just like the remote script execution, there's a drop-down here to just get the top-end processes, top 10 processes. I think the default is 10 here. You just run that, and you'll get the PID, you'll get the the process name, right? And then who's the owner, and again, we can kind of combine this with script execution too. So if we do see a service that is maybe hung or ran away or eating all of our resources, we can actually go back into the script execution and say stop that service or kill that process, right? So these two tools really work together quite well. So taking a look at the service monitoring, so there is the status property. Now, I'll just call out, because this is a property, right, it's only going to update within vRealize operations if there's a change. So we're not going to see every 5 minutes, yep, it's up, it's up, it's up, it's up, right? We're only going to plot a data point if that status changes, or we're going to update the property if that status changes for running. So again, we can leverage, there are out-of-the-box alerts, so we can send Slack messages, email, use custom webhooks to do whatever, right? Or we could even leverage the vRealize Orchestrator management pack to maybe orchestrate some sort of resolution. Hey, if we know that this service, maybe we can create a workflow to restart the service if we see that it goes down through vRealize Orchestrator. So some pretty cool stuff we can do there. Other cool use cases for service discovery would be if we're trying to patch things, right? Or if there's a vulnerability for a specific service that we might be running. We can get version information for a lot of the services. It's not available for all services. It really depends upon the publisher and whether or not they make that information available to us. But we can use this for helping us to plan out patching activities, right? Create a report for all of our services, right? So in this case, we're looking at Apache and MySQL. I've got the version numbers of each. So now I can start to scope out, okay, which virtual machines do I need to patch? So other cool use cases for service discovery. Now let's move on and talk about the agent-based ways we can monitor applications. And we're going to start off with the vRealize Operations Telegraph agent. Now again, this agent is completely managed from within the vRealize Operations UI, and of course there are APIs available to do a lot of this as well, but we can do things like install the agent, upgrade the agent, and even uninstall the agent. We can also configure the agent from within the UI. So things like custom script monitoring, or even just being able to configure the agent to talk to our applications. Take, for example, a database. We need to provide credentials to connect to the database to be able to pull metrics out of it. Or say Apache, right? We need to point the agent to our Apache services page to be able to get those metrics from there. This does support Windows and Linux-based virtual machines, and again, we can do some custom script monitoring as well as ICMP monitoring, ping monitoring, or HTTP monitoring as well through this agent. Now, once the agent is installed on our virtual machines, we'll automatically start collecting OS metrics from that virtual machine. So there's really nothing more we need to do. And then once the agent is installed, it's also going to go out and discover what applications are available on this virtual machine. So again, we've got all the predefined applications within vRealize operations, and so it's just going to go out and find those. So if they are discovered on that virtual machine, then the next step is to be able to configure that agent to talk to those applications and to be able to pull out that metric data. Now, we do support Windows Server 2012 R2 up through 2012 all the way up through 2019. We also support Red Hat Linux, Photon OS, of course, Ubuntu, SUSE, Oracle Linux, and CentOS. So if you're running any of those, which most customers are, right, you're going to be running one of those versions or one of those flavors, then this is a good option for you, especially if you have those applications that we provide out of the box through this Telegraph agent. Now, one of the reasons why we would want to do this, not only to be able to collect metrics from the application, but we also get that full visibility, right? We understand that this application is running on this OS, which is running on this virtual machine, right? That runs on this host, that so on and so forth. So we can really go from that infrastructure down to the application. Maybe the problem starts with the application. Maybe we're getting tickets from those users that application Y is running sluggish. Well, we can take a look at those metrics, right? We can start with the application and work our way up through the infrastructure if need be. This is also great for the troubleshooting workbench in vRealize operations, right? Which leverages these object relationships to be able to look across all the metrics and all the changes that are happening within the environment to bubble those up for us, right? And we can say, hey, I'm trying to troubleshoot this virtual machine, but I want you to go several levels above and several levels below as far as parent and child objects go, right? And we can look across all the metrics for the application all the way through to the host or even beyond that. We can also do things like metric correlation too. So if we are seeing spikes in CPU for that virtual machine, well, maybe we can correlate that to the specific application that is causing those spikes. So a lot of great stuff we can do with just even this visibility and just the relationships that are provided through vRealize operations and the Telegraph agent. So again, we have 25 of the most common applications available out of the box here through the vRealize operations Telegraph agent. Again, once we install that agent, we're automatically going to pull in those OS level metrics, and the Telegraph agent will discover what applications are installed on there. And then again, we support Windows and Linux OSs, and we've already covered what versions and what flavors are supported through here. Now again, like I mentioned, there is the complete lifecycle of the agent, which is configurable within the vRealize operations UI, but then there's also a scripted based install. So if you are deploying your own virtual machines through something like vRealize automation, right? A lot of customers previously would leverage the vRealize operations APIs to get that agent installed on that virtual machine, because we can't just bake the Telegraph agent into that virtual machine because that could get a little bit confusing for vRealize operations if every Telegraph agent all has the same metadata, right? We may not know necessarily where that information is coming from. So we need to install the agent after the virtual machine has been deployed. So The scripted install actually makes things a whole lot easier, right? If you're not into leveraging, REST APIs, the scripted install is a great way to incorporate this into your automation. But again, here, really just showing the UI on the front here, the UI within vRealize Operations 8.6 to, again, where we can go to install the agent, update it, start it, stop it, and then also to configure the applications that, were discovered here. So, of course, within the UI, we will show what was discovered, but then on the right-hand side here, there's a call out for the number of applications that are configured. So if we've got multiple databases running on this virtual machine, right, it'll actually give us the count of what is actually configured versus, what's not. So all of that's available within the UI. Again, the configuration workflow, once we discover that application, we basically just go in and configure it here. So in this case, I'm looking at an Oracle database and providing the credentials to be able to connect to the database to be able to pull those metrics out, right? We can't connect to the database. We can't get that information. So this is where we go to configure that within vRealize Operations 8.6. It's a little bit different than previous versions, so that's why it's called out here in this slide. Now, custom script monitoring is really cool. So say there is just a metric that you really need, right? Maybe there's a very specific use case or a something specific to your application that you'd like to pull into vRealize Operations. Well, this is available within the Telegraph agent. Now, again, as far as licensing goes, if we're going to run a script to pull in OS level metrics, you can do that with vRealize Operations Advanced. So if we want to look at things like file systems, you're fine to use vRealize Operations Advanced for that. But if you're going to start pulling in application metrics, right, that's where you need vRealize Operations Enterprise or vRealize Operations Cloud. So in this example here, we're basically just running a script. So the script lives on the virtual machine. In this case, it's a PowerShell script, but it could be a bash script for Linux. And, we're just going to execute that through the Telegraph agent. Now, one thing about the script is that it has to return a single integer value. Okay, so we can't accept tables, things like that, right? It gets a little bit complicated if we're trying to parse out information. And of course, if you're looking for, message-based feedback, that's where vRealize Log Insight can come in. But we're really looking at metrics in terms of integer values. So in this case, this script that we're looking at here is actually just counting the number of files that are in our C temp folder here. And as you can see, we are pulling in those metrics. It's available, underneath the OS level. The custom script is a child object underneath that OS object, which is also a child of the virtual machine. And then, from within there's the metric that we're getting from that script. So you can run multiple scripts on virtual machines too. Again, because you are limited to a single integer value that gets returned, there may be a need for multiple metrics. So of course you can run multiple scripts on a virtual machine, and this will run with every collection cycle. So Linux process monitoring. So we can monitor the various processes. So this is actually kind of different from service discovery. These are just processes that are running on the virtual machine. They don't necessarily have to be listening on a port, but we basically just provide the process name, provide a kind of a friendly, display name that we can show within vRealize Operations. And every 5 minutes, the Telegraph agent will go out and collect the status of that Linux process. So that gets configured here within the vRealize Operations UI. And of course, we can provide alerts for whether or not that process is running. Now, this is another thing that can be configured via REST API as well. So again, if there are specific processes that you want to monitor after you install the Telegraph agent, you can also enable that monitoring through APIs. This is also available in Advanced, Enterprise, and vRealize Operations Cloud, because again, we're not exactly reaching into the application to get metrics. We're really still kind of looking at the OS level, right? Is something running or is it not? And then we can do the same with Windows services as well. So again, just provide the service name. In this case, In the screenshot here, we're looking at the Windows Update service. Is it running or is it not running, right? And again, that's a child object of the guest OS, right? And every 5 minutes, we're going to go out and we're going to pull that. So there is, again, alerts for this so we can know whether or not it's running, or in this case, we can even run reports. Show me all the virtual machines where Windows Update Service isn't running, for example, right? So again, this is available in Advanced Enterprise or Cloud for Windows. And then another thing as far as availability goes is the applications that we're actually monitoring through the Telegraph agent within vRealize operations. We provide the availability of those also. So whether they're running or whether they're not, right? Send us an alert if things stop functioning. Now, there is an application troubleshooting dashboard within vRealize operations, and this will provide us it's a decent starting point if we're trying to troubleshoot something. So we select the application that we want to troubleshoot. We get a view of all the objects associated with that application, right? Are there databases underneath your MySQL application? Well, maybe we can dive into those, or we can kind of jump up to the OS level or the VM level, or even into the infrastructure level. And depending upon what we select within that object view and that relationship view, we'll get some basic KPIs about that selected object. So, if we are trying to troubleshoot something, this isn't a bad place to start, right? Because we are going to get some of those KPIs. We'll see if the application's available. We'll see, maybe if it's consuming too many resources, right? CPU memory or IO, or hey, maybe the connection count to our database just went through the roof, right? We can identify that very quickly through this dashboard. Again, the Telegraph scripted install, which we talked about, it's a shell script that we basically download from the cloud proxy, right? So you download this, you provide some basic information about the vRealize operations instance. So how do you connect to it, right? What's the FQDN for vRealize operations, and then some credentials to be able to run that install. And once that's run, then we can still manage the lifecycle of that agent through the vRealize operations UI, and we can still go in and configure the applications through the UI. And then the same for Windows, right? There's a PowerShell script that we can run. Same thing. We get it from the cloud proxy, and then once we run it, again, we provide the vRealize operations FQDN or IP address. How do we connect to it? And then the username and password to be able to connect to vRealize operations to make all of this happen. And this slide really just highlights the permissions that are required for the service account that we use for the installation of the Telegraph agent. So we just need these various administration and environment permissions for that account, so you're not stuck having to use your admin account, for example, right? Especially with a scripted install where we need to provide credentials. We don't necessarily want to expose our admin account for vRealize operations, because then somebody could log in and do remote script execution and all sorts of things. So this slide just really calls out what is required for that service account. Now, a couple things to call out too. For Windows, for example, the cloud proxies are using self-signed certificates. So for PowerShell, for example, right, we need to be able to basically skip the certificate check for that. So this just kind of highlights, what you do if you're running PowerShell 5 or PowerShell 6. Obviously has the skip certificate check for the invoke web request, and then for wget, just simply add no check certificate for Linux. And then of course, the PowerShell execution policy, we do need to bypass that because the script is not signed. So just another thing to call out when we're doing the scripted install. Now, through the Telegraph agent, we can also monitor physical OSs. So this is only OS level monitoring that we provide here. It's all in the documentation of how to install the Telegraph agent. Obviously, because it's not a virtual machine, right, we can't do all of that lifecycle management that we can for VMs as we can for physical OSs, right? So for physical servers, you need to install the agent yourself, and that's all available within the vRealize operations documentation. Now, as far as applications go, we don't provide that for physical server monitoring with the vRealize operations telegraph agent, but unless you're running Hyper-V, we do provide some basic monitoring for Hyper-V for physical servers. But again, other applications, we need to look at other approaches such as the open source telegraph agent, for example. And speaking of the open source telegraph agent, let's get into that right now. So once the open source telegraph agent is installed on your virtual machines, it looks just like the vRealize operations telegraph agent. We've got the virtual machine, we've got the OS, which is a child of the VM, and then of course we have the applications, which are child objects of the OS. Now, of course, again, we're not able to configure and manage the open source telegraph agent through the vRealize operations UI. This is something that you do yourself. But once the open source telegraph agent is installed on your virtual machine, and provided that you've got the cloud proxy configured, all of that is in the documentation. There's one slight change we need to make to it to be able to accept open source telegraph agent data. Once that's been completed, we can then download a script from the cloud proxy, which will configure the open source telegraph agent to send data to vRealize operations. So it configures the formatting as well as the connection to the cloud proxy to get that data in. Now, again, I mentioned you can use the open source telegraph agent for physical OS monitoring as well. And just one thing to call out here is, in these cases where there is no parent VM object, right? If it's a physical host, it's just kind of sitting out somewhere. There's no real infrastructure associated with it in terms, speaking in terms of like vSphere, for example. These will basically sit out there as kind of standalone objects, right? You'll just have a guest object or a guest OS object sitting in vRealize operations, but then we can still go into the application. That's a child object of that, and so forth. So just want to call that out too, that, again, physical boxes will basically be standalone items within vRealize operations. But again, the open source telegraph agent does give you a lot more flexibility as far as being able to monitor applications on physical servers. So just keep that in mind. Now, in vRealize Operations 8.6, we do support the latest open source telegraph agent, which is version 1.2. We support this running on Linux and on Windows. Now, Influx Data does provide a Mac OS agent, and while you could technically get that data into vRealize Operations, we don't support that. We're only looking at monitoring Windows and Linux OSs, so keep that in mind. Once you install the agent, again, we've got that script that will configure the agent. And then, of course, you need to configure the input plugins for the open source telegraph agent to pull in that data from those applications. And then, of course, the output plugins allow Telegraph to send that data to vRealize operations, but it can also send that data elsewhere as well. So, for example, as far as troubleshooting goes, I actually recommend configuring an output plugin to write to a file. Now you can configure that to say, roll the file over once it reaches a megabyte. So we're not going to fill up your hard drive, by just saving all these metrics, but that can be really useful in troubleshooting as well. I'm trying to figure out, okay, why am I not getting data into vRealize operations? Oh, okay, well, I have a misconfigured input plugin, right? Because I can see the metrics that the telegraph agent is collecting, and it's not collecting anything from this application. So now I know where I need to look. So hopefully that makes sense, but that's just kind of a tip for troubleshooting should you need it. So we can accept any metrics from the open source telegraph agent. So again, you're not limited to just those 200 plus input plugins that are available through the Influx Data website, or really their documentation site will link to GitHub and various other places to get the plugins. But you're not limited to those. So you can configure and maybe even write your own input plugins here. So again, the list of plugins is maintained by Influx Data. They are the publisher of the open source telegraph agent, or so you can just go to their website. URL is here, or you can just do a quick Google search for open source telegraph input plugins. So, again, just kind of bring home the point that this does open us up to a lot more applications that we can monitor through vRealize operations. We're not just limited to the curated applications that we provide out of the box, but this really opens up customers to be able to pull in data from really anywhere. And just kind of looking at how this sort of works. So this diagram shows of course, the operating system and the application. In this case, they're running side by side, but obviously we know the applications run on top of the OS. But this just kind of tries to highlight how the open source Telegraph agent works. So there's an input plugin for the operating system. This is actually configured once you install the agent on your virtual machine. It's already configured to pull in your OS level metrics, but there is an input plugin for the OS. And then, again, for the applications, we need to configure input plugins to, again, be able to connect to those applications, get those metrics out. Once they've been collected by the agent, then the Cloud Proxy output plugin is what the Telegraph agent uses to actually ship that data and format that data in the format that we expect to see it in, right? And it ships that to the Cloud Proxy, which then sends it to vRealize Operations Cloud or vRealize Operations on-prem. But I think the key thing here to point out is that we do need a Cloud Proxy to be able to collect those metrics. So lastly, let's talk a little bit about APM integration and how can we leverage the tools that your organization may already be using and maybe your application teams are already using. And we support in both vRealize Operations Cloud and vRealize Operations on-prem. We support Dynatrace, Datadog, AppDynamics, and New Relic. So one of the benefits here is that we don't need to install more agents on our virtual machines if we're already getting those application metrics from these tools. Well, we don't want to necessarily overload your virtual machines either, right? So we can collect that data from those existing tools. Not to mention, now we can look at the same information that your application teams are looking at. So if we're looking at, all that finger pointing, if it's not me, it's you, my tool says this, but my tool says that, right? Now we're looking at a common set of data between both teams to really be able to try and resolve the issue and pinpoint where the issue may lie. And kind of speaking of that, right, we've got full visibility from the virtual machine to the application, right? So just like we can with the Telegraph agent, for example, right, we can look at the application to the infrastructure. I think this is a really powerful piece here. Not only do you not have to learn yet another tool or go to yet another tool to be able to monitor the applications, right? We can actually leverage vRealize Operations. We can leverage a familiar tool that we already use. Plus, we can get from that application to the infrastructure from within vRealize Operations. We can also look at things like mobile applications too, right? So getting the AppDex scores and seeing what devices users are connecting to. We can get actually a lot of additional detail because APM tools do tend to look at more of the user experience side of things versus tools like vRealize Operations that do monitoring of things from the infrastructure level to the application level. There are a couple of dashboards as well that are available for each of the integrations here. So you need to install the management pack, and these dashboards are available. They're very basic. They're a good starting point, right? It's kind of hard to create a dashboard for every application. And so we see a lot of customers actually creating their own custom dashboards to tailored to their specific application. But again, these provide a pretty good starting point. We select the application, we can select the object within a relationship tree, and then depending upon what object we've got selected, we can see some KPIs for that selected object. So a good starting point, but you may want to tailor these dashboards to your own needs. And again, this is available in vRealize Operations Enterprise and vRealize Operations Cloud. So with that, I want to thank you so much for spending your time with me today. Hopefully you get a lot out of this session as we covered the A to Z's of application monitoring in the vRealize Operations. Thanks so much and have a great day.